The Rhine River stretched before them like a dark, living wall. Its surface shimmered under the moonlight, wide and cold, its current whispering a warning to any man foolish enough to cross. On the western bank, American soldiers crouched in silence, their breath visible in the chill night air. The faint rumble of artillery echoed behind them, the last heartbeat before the storm across the water. The German guns waited, hidden in concrete bunkers and forest shadows. Their crews peered through rangefinders, certain no army could cross this barrier alive. They had seen rivers stop entire offensives before to them. The Rhine was invincible, nature's last ally, but far behind the lines. Under tarpaulin covers and guarded lights, rows of strange six-wheeled machines stood ready, half truck, half boat. Their metal hulls gleamed like the backs of armored beasts. The soldiers called them ducks. In a few hours, they would glide into history and prove that no river, no matter how wide or deep, could stop the march of an army determined to end a war. By early 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final and most desperate phase. The Allies had clawed their way from the beaches of Normandy, through the hedgerows of France, and across the shattered towns of Belgium. Every bridge, every river, every field soaked in blood had brought them one step closer to Germany's heart. Yet one natural barrier still loomed ahead: the Rhine River. To the German High Command, it was more than just a river. It was a symbol, a final wall between the fatherland and invasion, stretching from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea. The Rhine was broad, fast, and flanked by towns that could be easily fortified. To cross it under fire seemed unthinkable for Hitler. It represented his last line of defense. In his speeches and orders, he framed it as Germany's sacred boundary, the Western Wall that would never fall. He ordered every bridge rigged with explosives and every town on its banks turned into a fortress. Civilians were evacuated. Engineers, dug in the Wehrmacht and remnants of the Waffen-SS, positioned their artillery, confident that the river would stall any Allied advance long enough for a counterattack to regroup. The Allies, however, had learned from hard experience. The rivers of Europe, the Seine, the Meuse, the Roe, had each taught them the cost of hesitation. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower knew that to defeat Germany completely, they would need to cross the Rhine fast, before the enemy could organize a prolonged resistance to achieve this. He planned a series of operations under one strategic vision: to smash the Rhine defenses from multiple points. Simultaneously in the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group prepared to strike near Wesel. In the center, the American 12th Army Group under General Omar Bradley aimed for crossings near Remagen and Oppenheim. To the south, General George S. Patton's Third Army was poised for a surprise. It wasn't just brute force that would carry them across. The Allies had technology on their side, an arsenal of engineering marvels built for mobility and speed. Among them were amphibious vehicles that could roll across land and swim through rivers. These odd-looking machines, officially known as the DUKW, but affectionately called ducks by the troops, were about to prove their worth like never before. The DUKW had already earned a quiet reputation in earlier campaigns. It had carried supplies to the beaches of Normandy and ferried troops through flooded fields in Italy, but few in the VAO German command had ever heard of them, and fewer still believed such machines could exist. Vehicles capable of swimming across a river while under enemy fire. As the winter of 1945 turned to spring, the Allied armies gathered their strength along the Rhine's western bank. The roar of engines and the thunder of artillery filled the air as engineers built pontoon bridges, ferries, and supply depots. Towns like Remagen, Wesel, and Mainz became staging grounds for what would be one of the most audacious operations of the war. The Germans, exhausted and fragmented, watched through binoculars from across the river, Some still clung to hope that the Allies would falter here, that the Rhine, this ancient boundary, would finally halt their momentum. Others knew better ammunition was low, reinforcements scarce, and Luftwaffe support nearly non-existent still. They prepared to fight. Every crossing point was targeted, every bridge mined, and every inch of ground on the eastern bank zeroed in for artillery fire. German commanders believed that even if the Allies tried to cross, the river's width and their gunfire would annihilate them before they could reach the far side. But on the night of March 23, 1945, as the Germans waited in silence, the first low growl of engines echoed from the shadows beyond the river. The ducks were rolling into position. In the darkness before dawn on March 24, 1945, the western bank of the Rhine erupted into a controlled chaos of engines, orders, and determination. Thousands of Allied soldiers prepared for what might be the last major river crossing of the European War. The cold air was thick with the smell of fuel and anticipation. Operation Plunder, Montgomery's meticulously planned assault on the northern Rhine, was set to begin across a front stretching from Ries to Wesel. The British Second Army and the U.S. Ninth Army were positioned shoulder to shoulder, ready to strike at the same time. In the center, American forces under General Bradley were preparing for their own crossings. Further south, the coordination was staggering. Air assaults, artillery barrages, paratrooper drops, and engineering units all synchronized to breach the Rhine's natural fortress for weeks. Allied intelligence had mapped every bend of the river, every gun position, and every German stronghold on the far side. Photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft revealed trenches, machine gun nests, and minefields. The Allies knew what awaited them. Still, the crossing would not be easy. The Rhine was nearly 400 yards wide in most sectors, with strong currents that could overturn small boats or drag heavy pontoon sections downstream. The Germans had placed barbed wire and obstacles in the water and covered likely landing zones with machine gun crossfire. Any conventional crossing would cost thousands of lives. That was where the DUK came, inborn from American ingenuity and necessity. The DUKW was an amphibious six-wheel drive truck developed in 1942. It looked ungainly, part boat, part truck, but its design was revolutionary, with a watertight hull, a propeller for water propulsion, and a unique system that allowed drivers to adjust tire pressure on the move. It could go from land to water and back again in seconds. Each DUKW could carry 25 soldiers or up to 25 tons of cargo, including artillery shells, food, or even small vehicles. Most importantly, it could do so across rivers, flooded terrain, and beaches where traditional vehicles couldn't go. By early 1945, over 20,000 of them had been built. They had proven their worth in Sicily, Normandy, and the Pacific. But the Rhine would be their most daring test. Yet the Germans never expected the Americans to attempt a mass amphibious crossing with wheeled trucks. Their defensive strategy was built on assumptions of conventional bridging operations. They believed the Allies would spend days constructing pontoon bridges under artillery fire, giving the defenders ample time to strike. But instead, the Allies planned to hit hard and fast. The Ducks would lead the charge, gliding across the Rhine under darkness, carrying infantry, engineers, and supplies directly onto enemy-held shores. Behind them, pontoon bridge teams and Bailey bridge units would follow to establish permanent crossings in the skies above. The Allied air forces prepared to unleash one of the most intense bombardments of the war. Bombers of the Royal Air Force and the U.S. 8th Air Force were scheduled to pound German positions for hours before the first DUKWS entered the water. At the same time, the 18th Airborne Corps, including the legendary 17th and 6th Airborne Divisions, readied for a massive parachute and glider drop east of the Rhine. In Operation Varsity, the goal was clear. Strike with overwhelming speed and coordination so that the Germans would have no time to react. When the sun finally began to rise on March 24th, the riverbanks glowed with the fire of thousands of explosions. Artillery from hundreds of guns thundered from the western shore, creating a curtain of destruction that hid the movements of the amphibious assault teams. From under a curtain of destruction, the smoke emerged the silhouettes of DUKWs rolling into the river, dozens of them. Engines churning, waves splashing against their hulls on board. American and British soldiers gripped their weapons, their faces lit by the flashes of distant gunfire. They knew that on the far bank, German machine guns and 88mm cannons waited. The men had been told that once they made it across, there would be no turning back the Rhine, the river Hitler had sworn would protect. Germany was about to be challenged not by bridges or boats, but by floating trucks driven by determination, innovation, and sheer willpower. And as the first DUKWs slipped into the river, the final phase of the Allied invasion of Germany truly began. The crossing of the Rhine was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a convergence of human endurance, mechanical ingenuity, and strategic brilliance. The DUKWs, affectionately nicknamed ducks, were not just vehicles. They became symbols of how technology could redefine warfare from every angle: human, tactical, technological, and psychological. The Rhine assault revealed a new face of modern war for the soldiers who rode inside the DUKW. The experience was unlike anything they had faced before. These were not specialized naval crews, but ordinary infantrymen, engineers, and truck drivers turned amphibious pioneers overnight. Many had trained for weeks along the Maas and the Meuse rivers, rehearsing how to drive straight into the current, how to bail water manually if the hull was hit, and how to disembark under fire. Private George Patton, of the 17th Armored Engineers, later recalled that the sound of the DUKW's propeller was the most haunting noise he'd ever heard, not because of its volume, but because it marked the moment of no return. Once the propeller engaged, there was no stopping until the far bank was reached. Men sat shoulder to shoulder inside the metal hulls, their rifles wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the spray. They whispered prayers, smoked in silence, and listened to the distant rumble of artillery. The Rhine's black water reflected the glow of flares and explosions. For many, it felt as though they were crossing into another world, one that promised either triumph or annihilation. Behind them stood their officers, often riding in separate DUKWs to coordinate movements. Many of these leaders had survived Normandy and the Ardennes. They understood the cost of hesitation. One wrong turn in the current could mean capsizing or drifting downstream into enemy fire. But despite every danger, morale remained astonishingly high. The men trusted their machines and their engineers. Brilliance of the Rhine crossing lay in its timing and deception. The Germans had expected the Allies to cross days later, after prolonged bombardments and bridge construction. Instead, Montgomery and Bradley synchronized air and ground operations to achieve maximum shock. DUKWs were hidden under camouflage nets until the last possible moment, when the artillery barrage began. It masked the roar of their engines. German observers, blinded by smoke and concussions, couldn't immediately identify what was happening. Some even mistook the amphibious vehicles for damaged landing craft being washed downstream. Then, as the first DUKWs reached the far bank, entire companies of American infantry appeared seemingly out of nowhere, bypassing defensive bottlenecks and outflanking pillboxes before the Germans could react. German officers reported over field radios that floating trucks were coming ashore, a phrase that initially baffled headquarters staff. By the time commanders realized the scale of the crossing, it was too late. The Allied foothold was already secure. This tactical deception worked perfectly because of speed. The DUKWs could land, unload men or cargo, and return to the water within minutes. They became mobile lifelines, ferrying ammunition, medics, and even artillery across the river while under fire. Traditional bridging operations, which normally required hours of preparation, were replaced by an amphibious flow of supplies that the Germans simply couldn't disrupt fast enough. The DUKWs turned the Rhine, long seen as an unbreachable defensive line, into just another obstacle. The DUKW was one of those inventions that proved necessity truly is the mother of innovation, designed in less than 9 months. It was a collaboration between General Motors and the National Defense Research Committee. Its code name, DUKW, wasn't meant to sound like duck at all. It came from GM's manufacturing code. D for 1942, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. Yet the nickname stuck. And so did its reputation. Engineers had created a vehicle that could be both a truck and a boat, switch tire pressures on the move, and carry its own propeller and rudder system. The amphibious ability was so finely tuned that DUKWs could drive straight into the Rhine's strong current and keep steady even under load during testing. Some engineers doubted the design's seaworthiness until it survived 10-foot Atlantic waves near Cape Cod later. It proved indispensable in Sicily and Normandy, where it ferried vital ammunition over beaches too soft for jeeps or trucks. By 1945, the DUKW had evolved into a battlefield essential. Entire amphibious companies were built around it, and its reliability earned it the respect of both soldiers and commanders in the Rhine operations. The trucks made hundreds of trips a day, transporting everything from bazookas to bulldozers. German engineers, examining captured DUKWs later, reportedly marveled at their simplicity. They couldn't understand how something that looked so fragile could perform so flawlessly under combat conditions. For the German defenders on the eastern bank, the night before the crossing had felt routine. They were tired, under strength, and mostly made up of Volkssturm units, older men and boys armed with outdated rifles and Panzerfausts. Their officers reassured them that the Rhine would hold after all. Even Napoleon had struggled to cross it under fire, but when the bombardment began, followed by the eerie hum of engines over water, confusion reigned. The men couldn't see through the smoke, and communication lines were cut by shellfire when reports came in of wheeled boats landing troops. Many officers dismissed them as hallucinations caused by exhaustion. By dawn, the illusion of an impenetrable river barrier had been shattered. Positions that were supposed to hold for days fell within hours. The defenders, once confident that geography favored them, now found that technology had rewritten the rules of war. The DUKWs had proven not only that the Rhine could be crossed, but that no natural barrier was safe from Allied ingenuity. From the eyes of engineers to the fears of defenders, every angle of the operation told the same story. Germany's last defensive line was no longer a wall, but a bridge. When the U.S. Army reached the western banks of the Rhine in March 1945, German commanders believed the river itself would become their greatest ally. The Rhine, broad, swift, and cold, was the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany. It had always been considered impassable under fire. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt described it as the final wall of the Reich. Every bridge was rigged for demolition, every crossing point prepared for defense. The Germans believed that even if their armies were in retreat, the Rhine would halt the Allies long enough for a counterstroke. The logic seemed sound by late March. The Wehrmacht's once mighty divisions were battered, but not broken, in small pockets. German units dug in along the east bank, veterans from the Ardennes and new recruits from Volkssturm militias, all clutching rifles in frozen hands. Panzerfaust teams hid among the ruins of riverside towns, watching through fog for the first sign of movement. Across from them, American engineers surveyed the river, calculating depth, current, and approach routes. For the Germans, the greatest fear was not tanks or bombers, but something far stranger: the small, squat, amphibious trucks the Allies called DUKWs. Ducks they looked unimpressive, almost comical, 6 wheels, a boat-like hull, and a propeller at the rear. Yet these floating trucks had already changed the course of the war in the Pacific and on the beaches of Normandy now. They were about to face their greatest test, crossing the Rhine under enemy fire. The Americans had studied the problem meticulously. Traditional bridging would take hours, sometimes days, under such heavy artillery zones, but the Ducks offered a different solution. Mobility, they could carry infantry, ammunition, and supplies directly across the river without waiting for pontoon bridges. Engineers waterproofed their engines, checked propellers, and loaded them with men and gear. Each Duka carried up to 2.5 tons, everything from mortar to radio equipment. On the night of March 22, 1945, Operation Plunder began. General Montgomery's 21st Army Group, supported by the U.S. 9th Army, launched the assault across a wide front near Wesel and Ree. Searchlights on the far bank reflected off the river, creating an eerie silver glow. The Germans could see movement in the darkness, but they could not believe what they were seeing. Dozens of ducks slid silently into the water, their small engines chugging as they formed tight formations. Artillery thundered from the western shore. More than 4,000 guns fired in synchronized waves, the ground trembling with each salvo. German observation posts disappeared in clouds of dust and fire, and then, through the haze, the Ducks' advanced infantry crouched low inside, gripping their weapons as tracer rounds zipped overhead. Some vehicles sank immediately after hitting submerged debris. Others veered off course in the current, only to recover and push forward from the German trenches. It looked surreal, trucks floating over water, carrying men straight into battle. Machine gunners opened fire, the air filled with the staccato rattle of MG-42s. One DUKW burst into flames, its metal skin glowing orange before slipping beneath the current. Another reached the opposite bank, its soldiers leaping out and scrambling up the mud. Within minutes, small footholds appeared on the eastern side, fragile but growing behind them. Sherman tanks and amphibious LVTs began their crossings. Engineers worked feverishly to assemble pontoon bridges under cover of smoke. The DUKWs, meanwhile, made constant trips across the river, ferrying ammunition, medics, and reinforcements. They became the arteries of the assault, ensuring that every rifleman on the far shore had what he needed to fight. German commanders tried to organize counterattacks. Mortar fire rained down on the riverbank. Snipers picked off engineers wherever they appeared, but the tempo of the Allied advance was overwhelming. The combination of armor, infantry, and amphibious support created a rhythm of movement the Germans could not disrupt. Every time a DUKW sank, 2 more took its place. Every time a platoon was pinned, tanks rolled forward to silence the resistance. By dawn on March 23rd, the impossible had become real. A full Allied bridgehead across the Rhine. American and British troops pushed eastward, linking with airborne units dropped earlier in the night. The Germans had lost their natural wall. Reports from captured officers revealed disbelief. "We thought they would never dare to cross here," one prisoner said. "The river was supposed to protect us." The DUKWs had proved something extraordinary. Logistics could be as decisive as firepower without them. The Rhine might have held for days with them. It fell in hours. The river, once considered untouchable, had been conquered not by massive battleships or daring paratroopers, but by hundreds of small floating trucks piloted by ordinary soldiers. For the Allies, the tactical success of the crossing was not just a matter of geography. It was a triumph of engineering and coordination. Each branch of the military had worked in perfect harmony: artillery softening defenses, air cover disrupting German reinforcements, amphibious units bridging the river, and armor pushing inland. It was a symphony of precision, refined through years of trial, loss, and adaptation. As the sun rose over the Rhine, The water shimmered with wreckage, burned-out ducks, twisted pontoons, and the shadows of men who had fallen mid-crossing. But for those who reached the far shore, the meaning was clear. The river that was meant to save Germany had instead marked the beginning of its end. From that day onward, every German soldier knew the truth. If the Allies could cross the Rhine, nothing could stop them from reaching Berlin, and that realization, spreading like wildfire through the Wehrmacht ranks, would ignite the next great chapter of the war's final act, the rapid, unstoppable Allied advance into the heart of the Reich. March 23, 1945. 21 o'clock hours, the air over Western Germany pulsed with the sound of artillery for hours. The ground shook as British and American batteries unleashed one of the heaviest bombardments of the European war. The sky flashed red and white, thunder echoing across the Rhine Valley. Civilians huddled in basements miles away thought an earthquake had begun. But this was no earthquake. It was the opening act of Operation Plunder, the Allied assault that would shatter Hitler's final defensive line on the Western Bank. The U.S. Ninth Army and British Second Army stood ready behind them, stretched in endless procession of trucks. Tanks, bulldozers, and amphibious craft searchlights turned night into day. Reflecting off low clouds in ghostly beams, engineers checked cables, radios crackled with final orders. And along the river's edge, row upon row of DUKWs waited in silence. Each DUKW bore the scars of service. They had landed on the beaches of Normandy, ferried men through flooded fields in Holland, and now sat poised for their most dangerous crossing, painted olive drab, coated in mud and oil. They lined up like a fleet of small ships awaiting the signal to depart inside. Soldiers adjusted helmets and whispered prayers. The men knew the Rhine crossing would not be easy, but they also knew, once they were across, there would be nothing left to stop them from reaching Berlin at exactly 21 o'clock. The order came, go from behind the lines. More than 5,000 Allied guns roared in unison. The first salvos screamed across the river, striking the far bank in waves of flame. German artillery positions vanished under the barrage. The ground erupted into fountains of dirt and fire. Smoke drifted thick across the water, masking the movement of the advancing waves. It was the largest concentrated artillery fire since D-Day under that thunderous curtain. The DUKWs began to move. Their drivers gunned the engines, propellers spinning as they slipped into the current. Dozens at first, then hundreds, each carrying soldiers of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. The water churned around them, glowing faintly from burning oil on the surface. Overhead, the deep drone of bombers added to the chaos. RAF Lancasters and USP-26 Marauders striking German strongpoints farther inland. To the men inside the DUKWs, the crossing felt endless. The current tugged hard. Shells exploded nearby, and machine gun tracers streaked the air like molten rain. Some soldiers fired back with rifles. Others simply clutched the sides, praying to make it across. A few ducks were hit directly, disappearing in seconds. Others veered sharply to avoid wreckage. The river, once still and wide, became a boiling field of debris on the east bank. German units from the 116th Panzer Division and local Volkssturm regiments opened fire with everything they had left. Their defensive line, though shattered by artillery, fought fiercely. MiG-42s rattled from windows and bunkers. Mortar thudded into the mud. The defenders couldn't believe what they were seeing. Not boats, but trucks floating toward them. To many, it looked like a bizarre miracle or a cruel trick. But the ducks kept coming. Within 20 minutes, the first wave reached the far shore. Near Wessel infantry jumped out, crawling up the steep bank as smoke grenades rolled ahead to obscure movement. Engineers followed, laying charges to clear obstacles. By 22 o'clock, the first bridgehead was secure. Signal flares streaked upward, green for success. General William H. Simpson, commanding the U.S. Ninth Army, received the message and immediately ordered additional waves, more ducks entered the river, followed by amphibious LVTs carrying anti-tank guns and vehicles behind them. British assault boats ferried men of the 5th Scottish Division. The river crossing had become a relentless tide, methodical, unstoppable on the German side. Command confusion spread rapidly, telephone lines were cut. Radios jammed or destroyed, officers tried to regroup shattered platoons. But the scale of the assault was overwhelming near Ries. A local battalion commander reported, "Enemy forces crossing in strength, vehicles floating, cannot stop them." His message was the last one recorded before his position was overrun by midnight. The Rhine, once considered the invincible barrier of the Reich, was no longer a frontier. Allied forces held a continuous foothold stretching several miles. Tanks began rolling across hastily built pontoon bridges. Their treads clanking over steel plates, DUKWs now shifted to supply duty, carrying ammunition, food, and fuel to the men fighting inland. The crossing had turned from a gamble into a victory meanwhile. In the darkness above, another operation was unfolding, Operation Varsity. The largest airborne assault ever conducted on a single day at dawn. Over 16,000 paratroopers from the British 6th and U.S. 17th Airborne Divisions would descend east of the Rhine to cut off German reinforcements. The entire operation was synchronized with the river crossing, ensuring that no retreat or regrouping could occur. But for now, under the pale glow of flares and burning oil, it was the ducks that carried the war forward. The soldiers who rode them would later describe the crossing as surreal, the mixture of terror and awe. The hiss of bullets over water, the strange quiet between explosions. One corporal from the 79th Division later wrote, "It felt like we were driving straight into the heart of Germany, and nothing could stop us." By the early hours of March 24th, more than 16,000 men and 1,000 vehicles had crossed successfully. The Rhine, Germany's great river of legend, its ancient line of defense, had been breached in a single night. And with every hour that passed, the realization grew clearer. The end of the Third Reich was no longer a matter of if, but when. The ducks had done what even German generals thought impossible. They had carried an entire army across a river under fire. And they had done it faster than any bridge or ferry could have allowed. The next phase, the full breakout beyond the Rhine, was about to begin. March 24, 1945. Dawn as the first light crept over the misty banks of the Rhine. The full scale of the Allied assault revealed itself. What began as a thunderous night crossing now unfolded into a massive invasion across a shattered river line. Columns of DUKWs, landing craft, and pontoon ferries stretched from horizon to horizon. The air reeked of fuel and cordite. The river was alive, an artery of motion feeding the unstoppable advance of the Allied war machine. The German defenders, who had once believed the Rhine to be an eternal wall, now saw only chaos. Communication lines had broken down, and commanders operated in near blindness. Reports from the front contradicted one another. Some said the enemy had been pushed back. Others claimed the river was lost entirely. The truth was worse. The Americans and British were already pouring men and armor into the heart of Germany in the early morning. Operation Varsity thundered into action. The deep drone of engines filled the skies as wave after wave of C-47 transport aircraft approached from the west. At 9 o'clock, the first paratroopers of the British 6th Airborne Division leapt into the smoke-filled air near Hamminkel. Minutes later, American C-46s followed, releasing thousands of men from the 17th Airborne Division from the ground. It looked like the sky itself was falling, parachutes blossoming through clouds of flak and smoke. German anti-aircraft batteries fired desperately. Black puffs of smoke burst among the formations, and several transports went down in flames. But it was too late. The airborne troops landed directly behind the German lines, seizing bridges, crossroads, and artillery positions within hours. They had linked with units crossing the river below. The trap was closing at Wesel. American infantry advanced through the ruins, clearing houses one by one. The once proud German town, its church spire shattered, was now little more than rubble, and smoke snipers hid in upper floors, firing until the last bullet. Resistance was fanatical, but isolated by midday. The stars and stripes flew from what remained of the town hall farther south, near Oppenheim. Elements of George Patton's Third Army had already crossed the Rhine days earlier. Taking the Germans completely by surprise, Patton had famously urinated into the river in mock triumph, declaring, "I've waited all my life to do this." His forces now surged eastward. Linking up with the Ninth Army's advance, the German front, once stretched along hundreds of miles, was collapsing from within. The DUKWs continued their relentless work as artillery fire lessened. They shifted from troop transport to logistics. Dozens shuttled back and forth across the river, carrying supplies essential for sustaining the bridgeheads. They hauled ammunition crates, medical gear, rations, and fuel barrels, a lifeline that kept the advance moving. Their ability to transition seamlessly from water to land proved invaluable. They were everywhere, tireless, and nearly impossible to stop. German soldiers who witnessed the amphibious vehicles up close were stunned. Some thought they were prototypes or experimental machines. Others assumed the Allies had discovered a new secret weapon. To the exhausted Wehrmacht troops, the DUKW symbolized something far greater than a machine. It represented an enemy with endless ingenuity, an enemy that could turn rivers into highways. By March 25th, the bridgeheads expanded rapidly. The British 15th and 51st Divisions pushed northeast, while the Americans drove east toward Munster. Tanks and self-propelled guns crossed on newly completed pontoon bridges, their steel hulls gleaming in the morning sun. Engineers, working with precision and courage, kept the routes open despite constant shelling. The German high command was in turmoil. Reports reached Berlin that the Rhine, once described by Nazi propaganda as the invincible moat of the Reich, had been breached at multiple points. General Alfred Jodl warned Hitler that the situation was untenable. Hitler refused to believe it. He issued impossible orders: hold every position, counterattack immediately, throw the Allies back into the river. But there were no reserves left, no divisions capable of carrying out such commands. The once proud Wehrmacht was now a patchwork of shattered units, Volkssturm militias and young conscripts barely old enough to shave. They fought bravely, but the outcome was inevitable. Artillery fire followed them everywhere. Allied aircraft strafed every road, and tanks closed in from every direction. The Germans were fighting a war that was already over. They just didn't know it yet. By the evening of March 25th, the Rhine crossing was secure. Over 30,000 Allied soldiers had crossed, with armor and supplies flowing steadily behind. The DUKWs alone had made thousands of trips, operating day and night, often under enemy fire. Many drivers worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, sleeping beside their vehicles before heading back into the current again. Their work was unglamorous but essential. Without them, the assault would have stalled within hours. For the Germans, the realization came slowly, like the fading echo of artillery fire. The Rhine, their last great defensive line, had fallen. It had taken the Allies less than 36 hours to accomplish what the Germans once believed impossible, what centuries of invaders had failed to do. From Napoleon to medieval kings, the Americans and British had done with precision, coordination, and innovation. In the ruined fields east of Wesel, a captured German officer stared across the river and whispered, "It was supposed to stop you." An American engineer nearby, covered in mud, simply pointed to the DUKWs and said, "These don't stop for rivers." By March 26th, Allied commanders were already planning the next move, a full-scale drive toward the Elbe River. Just 100 miles from Berlin, the Rhine had been more than a military barrier. It was a symbol of German pride, Of centuries of invincibility, its fall was psychological as much as strategic. For the first time, the German people knew the war had reached their doorstep. The Ducks, strange, amphibious, and unassuming, had played a role no one could have predicted. They bridged the gap between land and water, between planning and victory. They embodied the ingenuity and determination of the Allied war effort, turning what was once impossible into routine. As night fell once again over the Rhine, the fires of battle flickered on both banks. The river, once the last line of German hope, now carried only the reflection of Allied lights moving east, toward the heart of the Reich and the end of the war. The Rhine, once Germany's proudest natural barrier, was now behind the Allies. By the end of March 1945, what the German High Command once called the impregnable Western Wall had become a series of wrecked bridges, sunken ferries, and charred bunkers across hundreds of miles. American, British, and Canadian forces surged eastward in a flood that no defensive line could contain. Breach of the Rhine was more than a tactical victory. It was a psychological collapse. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised that the river was the ultimate shield of the fatherland, a line that no foreign army would ever cross again. But when the Allies crossed not just in one place, but at multiple points, Remagen, Oppenheim, Wesel, Ries, the illusion of invincibility crumbled. News spread like wildfire across Germany. Civilians in the Falaise, western towns watched in disbelief as columns of American armor rolled through villages that had once been deep inside the Reich. Many had believed Hitler's assurances that the Allies would never reach them. Now, they watched from shattered windows as the U.S. 3rd and 9th Armies passed their homes in endless convoys of trucks, tanks, and DUKWs in Berlin. The reaction was panic wrapped in denial. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice, treason, and defeatism. He ordered counterattacks that could no longer be executed. The Wehrmacht had no fuel, few tanks, and fewer trained men. Ammunition was running out. Morale was disintegrating, and Allied air supremacy meant that even movement in daylight was suicidal for the Allied soldiers. The mood was strangely mixed. There was triumph, yes, but also exhaustion. Many had fought since Normandy, through hedgerows, the Ardennes, and the frozen forests of the Bulge. They knew the end was near, but not yet within reach. Every bridge crossed, every town liberated came with new casualties. The Rhine crossing had been a success, but it had cost lives, hundreds of men killed or wounded in the push to secure the East Bank. Still, the momentum was unstoppable. Once the bridges were secured, the DUKWs continued their tireless work, ferrying mountains of supplies across the water. They carried artillery shells, medical equipment, and even livestock for field kitchens. Their flat decks were piled with crates marked rations and fuel, while their amphibious hulls bobbed over the current, linking the logistical arteries of the Allied advance. The Rhine crossing marked the moment when the war in Europe became a race, not against Germany, but against time. Eisenhower's strategy now focused on a broad front advance. Patton's Third Army pushing toward Bavaria in the south, Montgomery's 21st Army Group advancing through northern Germany, and the U.S. 9th Army driving east toward the Elbe. The goal was clear: reach the Elbe, cut Germany in two, and meet the Soviets moving westward from Poland. For the Germans, the situation was beyond saving. The once formidable Wehrmacht was splintered, entire divisions disintegrated without orders, their soldiers surrendering en masse. In some sectors, Allied troops advanced faster than their supply lines could follow. The DUKWs again proved essential, bridging not only rivers but logistical gaps, hauling food and ammunition to fast-moving spearhead. Civilians now flooded the roads in both directions, refugees fleeing the Eastern Front, prisoners liberated from camps, and townsfolk searching for lost relatives. The roads of Western Germany became rivers of humanity, all flowing westward, away from the approaching Red Army and the chaos that followed in its wake. American soldiers handed chocolate to children and bread to the starving. It was a grim mercy amid ruins by early April. Allied units had advanced over 200 miles beyond the Rhine. The industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr, was surrounded in a vast pincer movement. American forces encircled more than 300,000 German troops, cutting off their last major stronghold. The once proud army of the Reich was trapped, starved of fuel, ammunition, and hope at night. The glow of burning cities lit the horizon. The thud of artillery echoed across the plains, but now it sounded hollow, less frequent. More desperate German officers who had fought since France in 1940 saw the end coming with painful clarity. The Rhine, the symbol of the nation's strength, had failed them. The river that had once divided invaders from the homeland now flowed freely under Allied control for the DUKW crews. The mission was far from over. They continued to operate deep into Germany, crossing canals, rivers, and flooded terrain. The soldiers nicknamed their vehicles duckboats, a term that seemed almost comical, but for those who drove them, there was nothing funny about the work. They faced artillery, sniper fire, and exhaustion. Some died at the wheel, hit by shell fragments or caught in collapsing bridges, yet they kept going. Military historians later noted that without the DUKW, the Allied advance might have stalled. For weeks at the Rhine, traditional bridging operations alone could not have handled the sheer volume of men and materiel needed to sustain a full-scale invasion. The Ducks turned what could have been a logistical nightmare into an efficient, relentless surge forward across the Atlantic. Newspapers celebrated the crossing as a triumph of ingenuity. Headlines read, "Yanks cross the Rhine. Hitler's last barrier falls." Photographs of DUKWs, loaded with troops, filled the pages of Life and the New York Times. The American public, weary of years of war, sensed the end approaching, but for those who fought, there was no time to celebrate. Orders came quickly, maps were redrawn overnight, and the Rhine became just another line on a long road to victory. Ahead lay the Elbe, the meeting with the Soviets, and the final assault on Berlin. The river had been crossed, but the war was not yet over. The victory at the Rhine was both a triumph and a turning point, one that carried the Allies closer than ever to the heart of Nazi Germany. And in that relentless advance, the Ducks led the way, silent, tireless, and unstoppable. The crossing of the Rhine shattered more than Germany's defenses. It shattered the illusion that the war could still be won. In the days that followed Operation Plunder and Varsity, the Allied advance moved with a speed that seemed almost unreal. Town after town fell with minimal resistance. The German army, once feared for its precision and resolve, now fought in fragments, a collection of scattered units, desperate counterattacks, and hollow orders from Berlin that no longer reflected reality behind the front lines. Eisenhower's command centers buzzed with reports. Armored spearheads were racing east, seizing bridges over the Lippe and Ruhr. The Ducks and other amphibious vehicles became symbols of an unstoppable tide, ferrying troops, supplies, and artillery across flooded terrain that had once been considered impassable. What began as a crossing had evolved into a relentless pursuit. By the first week of April, Montgomery's 21st Army Group had driven deep into northern Germany, while Patton's Third Army surged south and east, sweeping through towns at a pace that astonished even their own commanders. The Rhine, once a line on the map, was now a memory. Behind them lay the last defensive wall of Hitler's Reich. Ahead lay the open plains of central Germany and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley. Here, the devastation was staggering. Smoke rose from collapsed factories. The skeletons of bridges and rail lines stood twisted over rivers and roads. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble by months of Allied bombing. Yet amid this wreckage, the machinery of war still churned. German workers, many forced laborers, tried to keep weapons flowing. Even as Allied tanks appeared on the horizon in early April, the Allies encircled the Ruhr pocket, over 300,000. German troops trapped between the advancing American and British armies. It was one of the largest encirclements of the Western Front inside. Field Marshal Walter Model, once one of Hitler's most capable commanders, faced an impossible situation. Supplies dwindled, communication collapsed, German soldiers, exhausted and starving, surrendered in droves. Model refused to abandon his men, but ultimately chose suicide rather than capitulation within weeks. The entire Ruhr pocket ceased to exist for the German people. The realization came slowly but painfully. The war was lost. Refugees flooded the roads. Civilians pushing carts, carrying children, fleeing eastward as Soviet forces closed in from the other side of the collapsing Reich. The Rhine crossing had opened the floodgates not only for the Allied armies, but for the chaos of Germany's final collapse. Amid the ruins, Allied engineers continued to build pontoon bridges, supply depots, communication lines, transforming the conquered landscape into a functioning corridor of war. The DUKWs, which had once braved artillery fire to cross the Rhine, now transported food, ammunition, and the wounded through the shattered remains of the empire they had come to destroy for the soldiers who had fought through the crossing. The mood was complex, pride mixed with fatigue. The Rhine had been the symbol of the final challenge, and now, with it behind them, the end felt both near and strangely hollow. Many could sense the weight of what lay ahead: the liberation of concentration camps, the discovery of atrocities, the full revelation of what this war had truly been about in the command tents. Eisenhower and his generals faced new questions: not how to win, but how to end the war responsibly, how to deal with the millions of German soldiers still in uniform, the civilians displaced. The territory that needed governing. Plans for occupation zones were already being drawn as April turned to May. Allied forces met the Red Army along the Elbe River, east met west, in a handshake that symbolized both victory and the uneasy alliance that would soon shape the world. The Rhine, once the Great Divide, had become the first step toward a divided post-war Europe. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The guns fell silent. The river that had seen centuries of conflict now flowed quietly again, its waters carrying no more soldiers, no more smoke, only memory. The DUKWs were parked in long rows, their paint chipped, their engines worn, veterans of a crossing that changed history. Many would later be scrapped, others left to rust in depots. But for those who had ridden in them across that cold, dark river, they would always symbolize something greater: ingenuity, courage, and the relentless drive to push forward. No matter the obstacle, the Rhine had once divided Europe. In March 1945, it united the Allies in purpose, and in its wake, a continent began to rebuild, scarred but free. In the quiet years that followed, the Rhine flowed again, calm, silver, indifferent to the history carved along its banks. Yet for those who had crossed it in March 1945, the river would never be just water. It was the boundary between tyranny and liberation, between despair and the beginning of Europe's rebirth. The DUKW ducks, once mocked as clumsy hybrids, became enduring symbols of American innovation, proof that ingenuity could turn even a river into a road. Their crossing wasn't just a feat of engineering. It was an act of resolve. When the Germans believed nature itself would shield them, the Allies turned that belief into their greatest advantage. Across the Rhine, towns rebuilt from ashes, bridges rose anew, and generations later, children played where soldiers had once fallen. But the memory endured in the journals of engineers, in the photographs of soldiers standing beside their amphibious trucks, in the faces of villagers who watched freedom arrive not from the skies, but floating across the current. The war in Europe ended soon after, but the lessons of the Rhine remained. It was a reminder that in war, obstacles are never absolute. only challenges waiting to be understood. It was the moment when technology and courage converged, when a nation's will to innovate helped turn the tide of history today. The Rhine is a place of trade and peace. Its waters crossed by cargo ships instead of convoys, yet beneath its surface lies the echo of engines, the rumble of DUKWs, and the memory of men who refused to stop at the water's edge, because in the spring of 1945, when the world held its breath, they didn't wait for the river to part. They built the means to cross it.